You probably imagine that being royalty in history meant living your best possible life. Golden palaces rising like dreams above bustling cities, beds covered in embroidered silk, meals served on gold-plated dishes, and servants waiting for your slightest command. It's the fantasy that has been painted in books, films, and tourist brochures for centuries. But strip away the layers of romanticized imagery, and you might see something closer to a nightmare. Imagine this. Tomorrow morning, you wake up to find yourself not in your bed, but within the high, locked walls of the Ottoman Sultans' imperial harem at Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. The first thing you'd learn is this. You have a 99% chance of never seeing your 30th birthday. Behind the marble corridors and glittering chandeliers lies a carefully maintained machine of control, humiliation, and disposal. This wasn't freedom wrapped in luxury. This was a silk-lined prison, where even your biology could betray you. Within these walls, 400 women lived in a place that, from the outside, looked like paradise, but inside could end your life before the next sunrise. Here, your monthly period might be the reason a guard knocks at your door with a silken cord in hand. Here, getting pregnant without explicit permission from the Sultan wasn't a scandal. It was a capital crime, punished by sewing you alive into a leather sack, tossing you into the Bosphorus, and rowing away in the dark. Here, after every intimate encounter with the ruler of one of the largest empires in the world, a circle of 12 men would stand in judgment over your body to decide whether you should be allowed to keep your womb. This was not an accident of cruelty. It was a fully functioning, bureaucratically managed system that kept meticulous records and followed protocol as precisely as a military unit. The Ottoman harem had rules and regulations that would put modern corporations to shame for their efficiency. Every death had a file. Every disappearance had paperwork. Every woman was entered into the system as an asset and deleted when she ceased to be useful. For centuries, this palace concealed industrial-scale femicide beneath the scent of roses and the gleam of gold. The Ottoman Empire preferred you to remember its soaring mosques, its domes and minarets, its military conquests, its celebrated poets, and its delicate art. It does not want you to remember the silver tray. The tray was small, beautiful, polished until it shone like a mirror, and it was feared more than any sword. On that tray, slips of parchment were placed, each bearing a woman's name. It would be carried through the harem's corridors not by the Sultan himself, but by eunuchs, whose hands were trained to hold it steady. The women would stand waiting in the great golden hall, wearing the finest silks they had been issued, but standing as still as prisoners awaiting sentencing. The air would be thick with perfume, not because they wanted to smell beautiful, but because any hint of natural odor could be used against them. The sound of the tray's approach was muffled by carpets, yet everyone knew it was coming. Picture the scene on a November evening in 1640. The chief black eunuch, Sunbul Aga, tall and impassive, entered the harem at precisely 8 o'clock. This wasn't a casual stroll. Every step had been measured, every movement rehearsed. He walked down the marble corridors in silence, the soft light of oil lamps catching the folds of his dark robes. Behind him came 2 junior eunuchs carrying the silver tray. The guards moved ahead, clearing a path, pushing aside the clusters of women who craned their necks for a glimpse. The journey from the Sultan's private chambers to the harem's golden hall always took 12 minutes, timed to the second, as though even chance should not be allowed to intervene. That night, one slip bore the name of a 17-year-old girl named Ayşe. She had been brought from Circassia 3 years earlier, a teenager when she arrived, now barely into womanhood. She was chosen, but when the eunuchs came for her, they found she was menstruating. In this place, a natural cycle was grounds for immediate removal. The official records, neat Ottoman Turkish in black ink, said sudden illness. Everyone knew what it meant. Ayşe was gone by morning. Her bed was stripped, her clothing collected, her name struck from the roster. Nobody was returned to her family. No prayers were said in public. If you were chosen and deemed suitable, the night would only grow darker. You would be led to a preparation chamber, stripped of your garments, bathed in scented water, and examined under lamplight by 12 eunuchs trained in medical inspection. They asked one question: should the seed be preserved? And the answer determined your future. If they decided no, the procedure to remove your reproductive capacity would be scheduled without your consent. If yes, you would be sent onward to the Sultan, with the knowledge that if you failed to conceive within the designated time frame, you would face the same question again. The statistics were brutal. Of 400 women in the harem at any time, perhaps 10 would bear children. 10. The rest lived in a purgatory of endless waiting. Being forgotten was, paradoxically, the safest outcome. Repeated selection without pregnancy marked you as a liability, and liabilities were relocated in the dead of night. This selection process was more than a system for producing heirs. It was a psychological weapon. Modern historians like Dr. Fatma Mujkikek have uncovered records showing that the randomness was an illusion. It was calculated to give women just enough hope to prevent rebellion, but never enough to feel safe. The result was corrosive competition. Women sabotaged each other, reported on rival cycles, and even celebrated when others disappeared. The cruelty of the system was that it turned victims into instruments of their oppression. One French ambassador in 1675 recorded that some women drank herbal concoctions to make themselves infertile, believing barrenness was preferable to being chosen. The empire invested heavily in these women, training them, clothing them, feeding them, and housing them in conditions of opulent confinement. But the investment wasn't out of kindness. It was about control. It ensured pure bloodlines, blocked political marriages, and kept succession under absolute palace authority. Religious justifications were twisted to support the system, declaring natural cycles impure in pregnancies without permission as theft from the Sultan. It's easy to think of this as medieval barbarity locked in the past. But standing in that hall, with your heart pounding as the silver tray draws closer, you would understand this was less about tradition and more about a machine, efficient, precise, and merciless. In a palace famed for its gardens, architecture, and jewels, the most beautiful object of all might have been the one that decided whether you lived or died. As the soft orange glow of oil lamps deepened into the night, the air in the harem changed. Conversations that had drifted lazily through the corridors grew quiet, and the women began to take their places. This was the hour when the palace's most feared ritual began, a selection ceremony that could raise you to influence or erase you from history before the next dawn. The atmosphere was thick with a strange mixture of perfume and dread, the kind of heavy tension you could almost taste. 400 women lived here, their ages ranging mostly from their early teens to their mid-20s. On nights like this, each one of them became a silent participant in a deadly lottery. The process itself was deceptively simple, almost elegant in its formality. Somewhere in the Sultan's private chambers, a polished silver tray was prepared, and on it lay folded pieces of parchment, each bearing a single name written in neat Ottoman script. The Sultan rarely made the choice himself. That would imply personal accountability. Instead, the eunuchs carried out the selection, turning life and death into a mechanical ritual. When your name was drawn, you were expected to smile, to bow, your head in gratitude, even as your heart pounded with fear. Showing reluctance was not just frowned upon, it could be interpreted as defiance, and defiance carried immediate consequences. For some, being chosen meant a chance to secure the Sultan's favor, and perhaps a safer position in the harem. For others, it meant a step toward an inevitable end. Records from November 15, 1640, tell of a girl named Ayşe, 17 years old, originally from Circassia. She had been in the harem for 3 years when the tray carried her fate to the Golden Hall. The chief black eunuch, Sanbul Aga, arrived at exactly 8 o'clock, not a minute sooner, not a second later. The journey from the Sultans' quarters to the harem always took 12 minutes, a tradition kept so strictly that even the smallest delay was noted in the logs. The tray, held by 2 junior eunuchs, moved through the halls as guards cleared the way. Every movement was measured, every detail rehearsed. When they reached Ayşe, they found she was in the middle of her monthly cycle. That alone sealed her. Fate, the official cause of death in the records, was sudden illness, but within the palace, no one needed an explanation. By the next morning, she had been erased from the harem's registers. If you were chosen and declared physically suitable, you would be escorted to a preparation chamber. There, 12 eunuchs trained as medical examiners would circle you, checking every detail of your body with clinical detachment. Then came the single, chilling question. Should the seed be preserved? This was not poetry. It was a ruling on whether you would be allowed to keep your ability to bear children. A no meant a scheduled procedure that would change your life forever. Forever. A yes only delayed the threat. If you failed to conceive within a set time, you would face the same judgment again. The odds were brutal. Out of 400 women, only about 10 would ever give birth to a child. Everyone else lived in a constant limbo, balancing hope and fear, praying to be ignored. Because here, being invisible often meant being safe. But there was another layer to the cruelty. The system was designed to turn women against each other. Documents uncovered by modern historian Dr. Fatma Mujgekek reveal that the appearance of randomness in the selection was calculated, was engineered to give just enough hope to keep spirits from collapsing entirely, but never enough to feel secure. Women monitored each other's cycles, whispered warnings or false information, and even celebrated when rivals were taken away. Instead of uniting against the system, they learned to survive by becoming part of it. One French ambassador, visiting in 1675, noted in his report that some women resorted to herbal potions that permanently damaged their fertility, a desperate choice to avoid the uncertainty of being chosen. It was a cruel paradox. Destroying your own body could be the only way to protect your life. Behind all of this was a chilling logic. Every woman in the harem was a valuable investment, purchased, trained, dressed, and housed at significant cost to the empire. The purpose of the selection wasn't just personal pleasure for the sultan. It maintained strict control over succession, prevented political marriages, and reinforced a system where women's bodies were state property. Religious justifications, rewritten and reinterpreted, gave the process a cloak of legitimacy. On the surface, the harem was a place of silks, jewels, and scented gardens. But on nights when the silver tray appeared, it was a court of judgment where the sentence was sometimes death and sometimes something worse, survival without freedom, in a prison too beautiful for outsiders to believe the horror it contained. The deeper you look into the Ottoman harem's selection process, the more it resembles a performance, one designed not for entertainment, but for control. Every movement, every word spoken, every flicker of expression on a woman's face was part of an unspoken script, and failure to play your role could cost you everything. The women knew it, the eunuchs knew it, and the system thrived on that. Mutual understanding of fear. This wasn't a clumsy or random cruelty. Modern research into palace archives shows that the selection nights were engineered like clockwork. Historian Dr. Fatma Mujgekek, after years of studying hidden documents, discovered the subtle but deliberate manipulations at play. The silver tray was not just a container for names, it was a psychological weapon, wielded with precision. The apparent randomness kept hope alive, but it was an illusion. The order of names, the frequency of certain women being chosen, even the timing of the selections, all followed patterns the victims could sense but never prove. The effect was corrosive. Instead of solidarity among the women, there was quiet, sabotage. Whispers in the corridors warned of supposed illnesses. Rivalries led to false reports about fertility or temperament, and small alliances crumbled under the weight of suspicion. The harem became a living example of divide and rule. Every woman was a potential threat, not only to your survival, but to your very place in the hierarchy. One particularly chilling account comes from a French diplomat, Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, who visited the Ottoman court in 1675. He noted that some women deliberately consumed herbal mixtures that destroyed their ability to conceive. It wasn't ignorance. They knew the cost. For them, the certainty of barrenness was safer than the gamble of being chosen and failing to produce an heir. Imagine living in a place where the intentional loss of motherhood was a calculated survival strategy. And yet, the harem was not an uncalculated expense for the empire. Every resident was considered an asset. The cost of purchase, training, clothing, food, and maintenance was high, but the returns in political stability, succession control, and influence over the sultan were seen as worth every coin. The state kept meticulous records, ensuring that each life taken or spared fit neatly. Into the grand strategy of the empire got religion, too, was meant to serve the system. Palace administrators twisted Islamic principles into tools of control, declaring natural biological functions impure if they interfered with palace schedules, and labeling pregnancies outside the official selection process as theft. From the Sultan himself, the body of a concubine was not her own. It was an extension of the state's property, and every choice, every function, every breath she took was subject to rules she had no part in making. The beauty of the palace. Its mosaics, marble courtyards, and gardens masked a reality more oppressive than the public would ever know. For visitors, the harem was a place of exotic mystery. For the women trapped inside, it was a theater where every performance might be your last, and every curtain call could be followed by the sound of footsteps in the night, not in a place built. To consume women, survival was rare enough. But to rise to the very top of the harem's hierarchy, that was almost unheard of. Yet one 15-year-old girl not only endured this deadly lottery, she mastered it, twisted its rules in her favor, and emerged as one of the most influential figures in Ottoman history. Her name at birth was Alexandra Lisovska, a Christian, girl from the Ukrainian countryside. The world, however, remembers her by another name, Roxelana, or, as she became in the empire's language, Harem Sultan. The year was around 1520. The fields of her village swayed with wheat and wildflowers. Under the late summer sun, Alexandra, the daughter of an Orthodox priest, spent her days in simple rhythms, helping prepare for Sunday services, gathering herbs, and carrying baskets of bread. But the day the Crimean Tatar raiders appeared on the horizon, all that was shattered. In hours, the life she knew was gone. Her village burned, her family slaughtered or scattered, and she was chained among dozens of other captives. The destination, the slave markets of Istanbul. For most girls, this was the beginning of the end. But Alexandra saw something different. Not an escape, but a transformation. She understood quickly that tears would win her nothing but pity, and pity had no power here. So she began to craft a new self, a persona with the charm of a jewel and the resilience of tempered steel. Within 6 months of arriving at Topkapı Palace, she had done what most women never even attempted: master Turkish, Arabic, and Persian to complete fluency. Palace records describe her uncanny ability to mimic accents and speech patterns until no one could tell she had not been born in the empire. Language became her camouflage, allowing her to slip unnoticed into every social current of the harem. But words were only her first weapon. Roxelana's real genius lay in how she studied people, especially one man, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. She watched his habits, learned his tastes, and tuned her behavior to resonate with his moods. If he lingered over poetry, she became a poet. If he engaged in political debate, she offered sharp, informed opinions. She was not just a mirror to his interests, she became a complement to them. Modern psychologists would later describe her approach as intermittent reinforcement, an unpredictable pattern of warmth and distance that keeps the other person hooked, always seeking your attention. Roxelana used it instinctively, making Suleiman not only interested but addicted to her presence. Her first great gamble came during a palace fire in 1524. While others fled, Roxelana was seen rushing into the flames to save one of the Sultan's favorite manuscripts. The story became a legend in the palace, proof of her loyalty and courage. But later studies of the fire's origin suggest a troubling possibility. The blaze began in a storage room that only she had access to. Whether by chance or by careful design, the disaster made her the heroine of the hour. The greatest coup of her career came a decade later. For centuries, Ottoman sultans had followed a rule. They took concubines, fathered children, but never married. Marriage complicated succession and politics. Yet in 1534, Suleiman broke that tradition, marrying Roxelana. Surviving letters from her to the Sultan show an extraordinary level of calculation, every phrase layered with emotional pull and subtle persuasion. She framed their bond as destiny, a love too sacred to remain outside the law. Once she became the Sultan's legal wife, her survival was more secure, but her ambitions didn't stop there. Her children needed to inherit power, and that meant eliminating rivals. Chief among them was Prince Mustafa, Suleiman's son from another woman. Popular with the army, competent in governance, and beloved by the people, Mustafa posed the greatest threat to her son's succession. Roxelana's plan to remove him took 3 years to unfold, relying not on open attack, but whispers. She spread rumors of rebellion, forged incriminating letters, and orchestrated overheard conversations that painted Mustafa as a traitor. In 1553, Suleiman ordered his son's execution. Mustafa was strangled with a silk cord in his tent, while Roxelana remained in the background, unseen but victorious. Witnesses said she showed no visible emotion afterward, no relief, no guilt. In the harem's brutal calculus, this was the mark of a survivor. Once Roxelana secured her place as Suleiman's wife, the stakes grew higher. In the Ottoman harem, there was no graceful retirement for aging concubines. The moment a woman lost the Sultan's interest, she risked banishment to the Old Palace, a place where discarded favorites lived out their final years in isolation and silence. Roxelana knew that if she wanted to avoid that fate, she had to make herself indispensable, not just as a lover, but as a political force. She bore 6 children with Suleiman, each birth strengthening her position. But in the harem's brutal hierarchy, that alone was not enough. The system rewarded power, and power required eliminating threats. After Mustafa's execution, Roxelana consolidated her influence, creating a network of informants that stretched from the palace kitchens to the imperial council chambers. Every whisper, every rumor, every half-truth that passed through those halls eventually found its way back to her. Historians now know that she controlled over 150 informants, some of them eunuchs, others serving women, and even a few officials. In the imperial bureaucracy, she had transformed the harem's culture of betrayal into her intelligence service. If a rival began to rise in favor, Roxelana knew before anyone else. If a plot threatened her children's inheritance, she had the means to stop it before it took shape. Her manipulation was not only political, but emotional. The surviving letters she sent to Suleiman are studied today for their remarkable psychological complexity. They read like love poetry, but every line is also a reinforcement of her control over him. One letter, written shortly after Mustafa's death, calls Suleiman the light of my life and praises his wisdom in seeing what others could not see. To the casual reader, it's devotion. To those who know the context, it's an artful reframing of paranoia as foresight, of cruelty as justice. In the harem, love was never just love. It was currency. And Roxelana spent it with precision. She understood that the Sultan, despite ruling one of the most powerful empires in the world, was still a man who wanted to believe he was loved for more than his throne. She gave him that illusion, wrapping it in poetry and loyalty, while securing her children's future. Yet her actions raise an uncomfortable question. Was she a monster, or merely a product of a monstrous system? Modern historians remain divided. Some hail her as a feminist icon who broke gender barriers, advising the Sultan on matters of state, commissioning architectural works, and shaping foreign policy. Others see her as a cold strategist who left a trail of bodies in her wake, including children who posed a threat to her son's succession. By the time she died in 1558, Roxelana had done what almost no other woman in the harem's 5 centuries of history had achieved. She was buried in a tomb beside the Sultan. She had beaten the system, but only by becoming as ruthless as the system itself. And while her story is extraordinary, it was also the exception. Most women in the harem had no such path to survival. For them, the palace had other ways of ensuring they would never leave its walls alive. By the time Roxelana's shadow faded from the harem's corridors, the machinery of control had not slowed. If anything, it had adapted, refining its cruel efficiency. For the vast majority of women here, there would be no transformation into a sultana, no poetic letters to the Sultan preserved in history. Instead, their existence would be defined by waiting and by the quiet certainty that their absence would one day be noted only in a ledger, not in memory. The palace had perfected the art of erasing a human being without noise. For outsiders, Istanbul's skyline was dominated by domes, minarets, and the shimmering blue of the Bosphorus. But behind the thick walls of Topkapi, silence worked like an artisan, shaping disappearances into routine. Women didn't vanish with the chaos of public execution. They dissolved into the still air of the Golden Hall, into the shadows of narrow corridors, into the ink of official records that called their deaths sudden illness or melancholy. The methods were varied, each chosen to leave no trace of blood and as little disruption as possible. Among the most infamous was the silk strangulation, a technique so clinical that it had its standards of timing and execution. The men who carried it out were known as bastanzi, the gardeners of the Sultan's household. Their gardening did not involve roses or tulips, but the pruning of human lives deemed no longer useful. These were not untrained killers. They were specialists, drilled in anatomy and muscle control, able to tighten the twisted silk cord with just enough force to block the windpipe and arteries simultaneously. Tradition dictated that the cord be 3 feet in length, twisted exactly 7 times for strength. 2 men worked together, one to restrain the shoulders, the other to deliver the killing pull. And yes, the palace even had performance reviews. For this, a successful execution, according to internal rules, was one completed in under 45 seconds. Anything longer could mean punishment for the Bastung, not for mercy, but for inefficiency. The logic was perverse. Death should be quick, not for the sake of the victim's dignity, but for the smooth operation of palace life. For some, silk was not their fate. The C punishment, Dani's Sivisi, was reserved for women who became pregnant without the Sultan's explicit consent. The ritual was as much about symbolism as it was about death. The condemned woman would be sewn into a heavy leather sack, her limbs pinned, and in one of the cruelest touches imaginable, Several live cats were placed inside with her. The scratching and thrashing ensured that she could neither hold her breath effectively nor keep still. A black-painted boat, used only for this purpose, would depart under cover of moonless nights, rowed to a predetermined point in the Bosphorus, where the currents would carry the body out toward the Black Sea. From 1520 to 1680, at least 3,000 women were executed in this manner, an average of 18 per year. Every year for a century and a half, the waters of the Bosphorus became so notorious among fishermen that certain stretches were called mermaid graveyards. Local superstition held that the fish there carried the taste of the drowned, and so catches from those spots were thrown back. Even nature seemed unwilling to fully digest the human toll of the palace. Yet death was not always immediate. For many, the worst fate was banishment to the secrecy, the Old Palace. It stood on the city's outskirts, a sprawling but decaying complex where women deemed past their prime, or guilty of minor offenses, were sent to live out their remaining days. A French diplomat who visited in 1670 described it as a marble tomb for the living, where hundreds of women sat in courtyards without speaking, their eyes fixed on nothing. Speech was discouraged. The residents developed their silent gestures and a crude sign language to communicate. Here, the punishment was time itself, stretching endlessly forward, unbroken by purpose or hope. For the empire, all of these methods came with calculated costs. A silk strangulation was cheap, 3 aki, roughly the cost of a decent meal. A sea execution was more expensive, 20 aki to cover the boat, the crew, and the secrecy. Banishment was the cheapest of all, requiring only a single transport. Murder had a budget line, and the palace's accountants kept meticulous track of it. Even the men who carried out these acts were themselves casualties of the system. Palace medical records from the 1600s show that Bostangs suffered disproportionately from melancholy and night terrors. In 1987, a journal belonging to one such man was discovered in an archive. Across 400 pages, he wrote endless apologies to women whose faces he could still recall. The repetition of their imagined voices haunted him more than the act itself. The system's religious justifications were as polished as its administrative ones. Palace clerics issued fatwas stating that women who disturbed the harmony of the harem were spreading corruption and could be lawfully eliminated. Passages from scripture were cited, reinterpreted, and stripped of original context until they served the needs of the palace. In this way, mercy and murder were made to walk hand in hand, their contradictions smoothed over by official decree. Then there was the punishment reserved for the most defiant, those who attempted escape. Known as ta suzluk, or the stone punishment, it was not stoning in the public square. Instead, the condemned was sealed alive inside the very walls of the palace. In 2010, during restoration work at Topkapi, archaeologists found human remains embedded within its structure, a grim confirmation of centuries-old rumors. These women were not just killed, they were erased so completely that they became part of the architecture. From the outside, the harem remained a place of shimmering tiles, fragrant gardens, and delicate music. Tourists in later centuries would wander its corridors, marveling at the beauty without understanding the weight of silence that hung in the air. But for those who had lived within its rules, beauty and brutality were never separate. The same silk that brushed the skin in the evening could tighten around a neck before morning. The same marble that cooled bare feet on a summer day could wall in the breath of the living. This was the polished art of disappearance, an institution's ability to make a person not just die, but vanish from the narrative entirely. And in the Ottoman harem, this art had been perfected over 5 centuries, until it operated as smoothly as any other arm of the empire. Night on the Bosphorus is unlike anywhere else in the world. The black water shimmers under starlight, moving in slow, deliberate ripples, as if the sea itself is thinking. But for the women of the harem, those waters were not a scene of beauty. They were an unmarked graveyard, and the quiet lapping of waves against the palace walls could sound like a death sentence approaching. The Ottoman court had perfected a method of execution that relied on these waters, one designed to preserve royal dignity, religious propriety, and above all, silence. It was known simply as the sack punishment. The process began in darkness, long before the city awoke. A woman accused of becoming pregnant without the Sultan's permission, whether the accusation was true or fabricated, would be summoned by eunuchs under the pretext of relocation. In reality, her fate was already decided. She was taken to a secluded chamber where attendants prepared a heavy leather sack. This was no ordinary container. It was thick, stiff, and deliberately cumbersome. Inside, the woman's arms and legs were bound, and then, in an act of cruelty almost theatrical in its detail, several live cats were placed in the sack alongside her. The scratching, clawing, and desperate thrashing of the animals served a purpose. It made the woman's struggles unpredictable, exhausting her before she ever touched the water. The boat used for this ritual was as much a tool of symbolism as it was of function. Painted entirely black, with no ornamentation, it left the palace under the cover of moonless nights. Its rowers silent, faceless men chosen for their ability to keep secrets, carried their human cargo to a preselected point in the Bosphorus. The location was chosen not only for secrecy, but for the certainty that the currents would sweep the body out to sea, ensuring it would never return to shore. Between 1520 and 1680, palace records suggest that at least 3,000 women were executed in this way. That's an average of 18 women per year for a century and a half. The scale becomes more chilling when you imagine it as a steady rhythm, a pattern that the palace maintained with bureaucratic consistency. The Bosphorus itself became part of the palace's machinery of control, a final corridor without walls, where no one could hear your voice. Fishermen who worked these waters began to notice. Certain stretches of the strait were avoided, even on days when fish were plentiful. Local superstition claimed that the fish there had eaten sorrow and carried the taste of the drowned. These areas became known as mermaid graveyards, though everyone understood the truth behind the name. Stories spread of strange shapes glimpsed beneath the waves, of long strands of hair tangled in nets, of pale faces appearing for just a moment before sinking again. Yet for the palace, this was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was control dressed as ritual. Islamic law, interpreted through the palace's owns, forbade the spilling of royal blood. The sack punishment allowed for death without visible injury, without the messy spectacle of public execution and the creation of martyrs. It was, in the twisted reasoning of the empire, a clean solution. The execution itself was carried out with methodical precision. The sack was weighted with stones, the knots tied in such a way that they could not be undone, even in the chaos of the water. Once the woman was placed inside, the cat's frantic movements ensured she would be disoriented and gasping for air before the first wave touched her. The rowers, practiced in the grim task, would pause briefly at the chosen spot before tipping the sack overboard. There was no ceremony, no prayer, just the dull splash and the slow disappearance of the ripples into the black expanse. For those left behind in the harem, the disappearance was understood, but never spoken of. The woman's room would be emptied. By morning, her belongings either redistributed or burned, and her name quietly struck from the records. Officially, she might be listed as relocated or sent to the provinces. In truth, her body was drifting far below the waves, carried toward a sea she had never seen in daylight. Occasionally, nature defied the palace's plans. Storms could wash a sack back to shore, and when that happened, the body was quietly buried, without a marker, often under the cover of night. No public acknowledgement was ever made. The purpose of the punishment was not only to remove a woman, but to remove her story, to ensure that nothing about her existence remained that could inspire sympathy or resistance. The Bosphorus became a participant in this system, its currents as much a part of the machinery as the palace guards. On calm nights, the water reflected the stars in perfect clarity. On such nights, the contrast between beauty and horror was sharpest. Above, the heavens. Below, the weighted sack sinking silently, accompanied by the muffled cries of creatures. Trapped inside in the harem, the knowledge of this fate acted as an unspoken deterrent. Women monitored each other's behavior, reported any hint of illicit intimacy, and avoided situations that could be twisted into accusations. The threat was always there, woven into daily life like a shadow stitched into the very fabric of the palace. And yet, for all its secrecy, the sack punishment was no myth. European ambassadors wrote about it with a mixture of fascination and disgust. Travelers recorded rumors they heard in Istanbul's markets. Fishermen's wives whispered about seeing the black boat glide silently down the strait. Even in its attempt to erase women, the system left traces, in memory, in rumor, and in the deep, cold waters that cradled its victims. If death was the harem's swiftest punishment, then exile to the Eski Saray, the Old Palace, was its slowest and most cruel. On paper, it sounded like a reprieve, a woman spared from execution, sent to live out her days in another imperial residence. In reality, it was a sentence of living erasure, a slow unwinding of identity until there was nothing left but silence. The Eski Saray stood on the outskirts of Istanbul, a sprawling complex of stone and faded marble, older than Topkapi and stripped of the opulence that dazzled foreign visitors. Its walls were high but plain, and its gates rarely opened. Time had dulled the brilliance of its tiles, and the air inside carried the faint must of damp stone, as though the building itself had been weeping for centuries. Women sent here were not escorted with ceremony. They traveled in closed carriages. Windows shuttered so no one could see their faces. The journey through the city was deliberately timed for the early hours before dawn, when streets were empty and the risk of witnesses was low. Inside the carriage, the women sat in silence, knowing that each turn of the wheels was carrying them farther from any possibility of return. Life in the Old Palace was governed by absence of purpose, of conversation, of outside contact. The women here had no duties, no visitors, no letters, and no hope. Days blurred together in the quiet courtyards, where the sound of footsteps echoed too loudly against the stone. Speech was discouraged, and over time, most stopped trying. The inhabitants developed a silent language of gestures, glances, and small hand movements to communicate. Even these were often guarded, as mistrust seeped into the few relationships that formed. A French diplomat who visited in 1670 described the place as a marble tomb filled with living ghosts. He wrote of women sitting motionless for hours, under the bare branches of winter trees, their eyes fixed on nothing, their bodies swaying slightly, as if to a rhythm only they could hear. The silence, he wrote, is so complete you can hear the sound of hearts breaking. The empire, of course, kept detailed records of this exile. Each woman sent to the Old Palace was noted in the harem's ledgers as relocated, her name crossed out of active rosters. The cost of maintaining her was calculated to the last coin, food, minimal clothing, and basic shelter, all at the lowest possible expense. For the state, exile was the cheapest form of disposal. No boat, no executioners, no silken cord. It was a way to remove a woman without the logistical effort of ending her life. But for the women themselves, the psychological toll was immense. Many were young when they arrived, barely past their teens, yet the Old Palace aged them quickly. Without purpose or hope, the body seemed to wither as the mind retreated inward. Some lost the will to eat, and their health declined rapidly. Others lived on for decades, but became shadows of themselves, their memories fading until even their names felt like stories about someone else. Occasionally, a new arrival would resist. At first, pacing the courtyards, attempting to rally the others, demanding an audience with the Sultan or the valid Sultan. But the old palace was patient. Its emptiness wore them down like water on stone. After weeks, even the loudest voices quieted. The resistance turned into resignation, and resignation into routine, that no one left the old palace. The gates opened, only to admit new exiles, or to allow the removal of the dead. Burials were unmarked, often at night in nearby cemeteries. The city outside went on as usual, unaware or unwilling to see the slow deaths happening within those walls. The architecture itself seemed to participate in the cruelty. Windows were placed high, too high for anyone inside to see the streets or the sea. Light filtered in at an angle that made the courtyards look smaller than they were, the shadows longer, the days shorter. In winter, cold seeped through the stone floors, making the air bite even indoors. In summer, the heat pooled in the corridors, heavy and airless. There was no season of comfort. For the harem, the existence of the old palace served a clear purpose. It was a reminder to those still in Topkapi. You could be removed at any time, not with the finality of death, but with the slow suffocation of life without meaning. For some, the prospect of the silken cord was preferable, a swift end rather than decades of hollow survival. The old palace was, in its way, as much a tool of control as the executions. It allowed the harem to rid itself of women who were no longer politically useful, who had grown too old, too outspoken, or simply out of favor, without the spectacle of killing them. It was a living grave, where bodies continued, but souls had. Long since departed dot in the city's collective memory, the Eskişehir barely exists. Tourists today rarely hear of it, and its remains are overshadowed by the grandeur of Topkapi. But for the women who crossed its gates, it was the last chapter of their story, one written in silence, in shadows, and in the slow, merciless passing of time. Among the many strange titles in the Ottoman court, few sound more harmless than Bastang. The word means gardener. Yet within the walls of the palace, everyone knew these men tended no flowers, pruned no roses, and harvested nothing from the earth. The gardens they maintained were not of soil, but of human lives, and their pruning shears were 3 feet of twisted silk. The Bastangsis were a special corps of palace servants, trained for discretion, obedience, and above all, speed. In public, they could be seen performing ordinary duties, escorting visitors, maintaining palace grounds, carrying supplies. But when the harem or the sultan himself required the removal of a person, it was the Bastangs who were called upon. In the empire's carefully constructed hierarchy, their position was paradoxical. Both menial and terrifyingly powerful training for this role began with anatomy. Young recruits, often drawn from loyal military families or selected palace servants, were schooled in how to locate the vital points of the neck, how to apply pressure to block the windpipe and the arteries in one motion. They practiced on animals, sheep, goats, even large birds, until their hands learned the exact rhythm and force required. Silk was always used, never rope or wire. Rope could fray, wire could cut. Silk was strong, smooth, and left no mark on the skin. The choice was as symbolic as it was practical. The empire's victims would die in the same luxury that dressed its rulers. The standard execution cord was measured precisely, 3 feet long, twisted 7 times for maximum strength. 2 men worked together, one to hold the victim's shoulders steady, the other to perform the strangulation. The process was meant to be silent, swift, and clean. The palace even kept records of timing. 45 seconds was the target. Faster risked mistakes. Slower was considered unnecessary cruelty and could result in punishment for the executioners. Efficiency mattered. When a woman in the harem was marked for death, she was rarely told outright. The notice came at sunset, a summons to prepare for relocation, or sometimes no warning at all. Those who suspected the truth often spent the night writing letters to families they would never see again. These letters were never delivered. Instead, they were locked away in the palace archives, where some remain to this day, gathering dust behind wooden shutters. At dawn, the Bastangs would arrive. They were recognizable by their red caps and short-handled axes, the latter symbolic, tools of their position, though rarely used for their grim work. The condemned was led to a quiet room, often one without windows. There was no trial, no public declaration of guilt. The only ritual was the cord, looped quickly around the neck, pulled tight until the body went limp. The silk was then removed, the cord carefully coiled for reuse, and the body wrapped for discreet removal. The palace records were as precise about death as they were about life. Each execution was logged in triplicate: the name, the date, the method, the official reason, and a satisfaction rating from the supervising official. Yes, the empire graded its murders. A good execution was quick and quiet, leaving no visible signs and creating no disturbances. A poor one risked noise, resistance, or, worst of all, witnesses. The psychological toll on the Bastangs themselves is harder to measure, but it existed. Medical records from the 17th century show they had the highest recorded rates of melancholia and night terrors among palace staff. In 1987, historians uncovered the journal of a former Bastang, written over decades. In it, he addressed each victim by name, apologizing for his role, explaining the orders he had been given. He wrote of seeing their faces in his dreams, of waking in the night with the feeling of silk still in his hands. They called me a gardener, he wrote, but I only ever buried seeds that never had a chance to grow. The harem relied on the Bastangs not just for punishment, but for control. The very knowledge of their existence, the sight of them walking silently through the palace, was enough to keep most in line. They were the unspoken threat that hovered over every argument, every whispered conspiracy, every glance at the May. Wrong man. The harem's rules did not have to be enforced every day. They only had to be enforced enough to remind everyone that they could be enforced at any time. And perhaps most chilling of all was the way the Bastang's work fit seamlessly into the palace's daily life. A woman could be seen laughing in the courtyard one afternoon and be gone the next morning, her absence explained away with a simple relocation. Meals were still served on schedule, music still played in the gardens, and the world outside the walls went on as if nothing had happened. The garden of the harem was kept in perfect order, even if its flowers were replaced more often than anyone dared to say aloud. In the Ottoman palace, death was not a disruption. It was just another form of maintenance. In Topkapi's harem, there was a hallway few dared to walk without permission, a place where the air itself seemed heavier, where the marble floor absorbed sound, as if swallowing every footstep into its cold, pale veins. They called it the Silent Corridor. The name was not official. No architect's plan or imperial decree had labeled it as such, but among the women of the harem, the phrase passed in whispers, its meaning universally understood. The Silent Corridor was narrow, lined on one side by high, unbroken walls, and on the other by a row of latticed windows, so finely carved that the outside world appeared in fractured slivers of light. Through those slivers, one could glimpse the palace gardens, hear the faint trickle of fountains, smell the distant orange blossoms in spring, but never touch them. The corridor was a threshold, a place between the living spaces of the harem. and the rooms no one wished to enter. The rooms where women awaited judgment. No official punished anyone for walking here, yet no one lingered. The Bastangsis sometimes passed through in pairs, their red caps bright against the dim light. When they did, the women nearby instinctively stepped back, pressing themselves against the cold wall, eyes lowered. It was not fear of the men themselves. The Bastangs rarely spoke, never threatened, but fear of what their presence signified. The silent corridor was their route, and to see them walking, it meant someone somewhere was about to vanish. Those summoned to the end of this hallway were told to bring nothing. The order would come quietly, often delivered by a Kalfa, senior attendant, in the late evening. Tomorrow you will be needed. That was all. The women slept little that night, if they slept at all, listening to the corridor's hush just beyond their chambers, wondering if each footstep they imagined belonged to their fate. Approaching by dawn, the atmosphere in the corridor had changed. The light shifted, the dust in the air became visible, and the faint scent of damp stone seemed sharper. 2 Bastangs would arrive, not in haste, but with a steady, deliberate pace. They never met the condemned woman's eyes. Their task was to escort, nothing more, and yet their silence was its form of communication, telling her without words that her life, as she knew it, was finished. The walk down the silent corridor was short, perhaps 20 paces, but it felt endless. Women later described the sensation as walking into the sea, each step heavier, breath harder to draw, the world narrowing until only the next step existed. The windows offered flashes of sunlight, fragments of leaves moving in the wind, reminders of a beauty that would soon be lost forever. At the end of the hallway lay a simple wooden door, unremarkable compared to the ornate portals elsewhere in the palace. Behind it was the chamber of judgment, though no judgment was given there. By the time a woman crossed that threshold, her fate was already sealed. There were no speeches, no proclamations, no final pleas. In some cases, the room was prepared for execution. The silken cord coiled neatly on a table, the floor cleared, a low stool waiting. In others, it was simply a place to inform her of exile, though that news was cold comfort. The corridor itself carried its history, invisible, but heavy. Generations of women had walked it, some in regal finery, others in plain linen shifts, all bound by the same unspoken knowledge. Over the centuries, the stone beneath their feet developed a faint depression in the center, worn by countless steps. Palace records mention that the floor was repaired twice, each time smoothed over, as if to erase the passage of so many condemned. But time, like memory, left its mark again. Servants avoided cleaning the corridor unless ordered directly, claiming the air there was unlucky or that strange drafts whispered down it at night. A janissary once reported hearing voices while standing guard there, soft, indistinct. Murmurs, as though women were still walking beside him, speaking in a language he couldn't quite recognize. He swore that when he turned, the space was empty. The harem's elders used the silent corridor as a warning for the young. "Do not let your steps take you there," they would say, not always explaining what they meant. It was not just a physical place, but a symbol of the palace's absolute control, of the thin line between privilege and ruin, of how quickly favor could vanish. The very act of walking it stripped away the illusions of safety that the gilded walls promised. And yet, the corridor remained open, visible, part of daily life. Women passed its entrance on their way to other chambers. Servants carried trays past it, and musicians sometimes played in nearby rooms. It was always there, quietly reminding everyone that the harem's beauty existed alongside its cruelty. That laughter could echo in one hallway, while silence devoured another. In this way, the silent corridor was not merely a passage. It was the embodiment of the harem's truth, that every step taken inside its walls was both a privilege and a risk. and that some steps could never be taken back. In the heart of the harem, beyond the chatter of courtyards and the rustle of silks in passageways, there was a quiet room where the most delicate rituals of life and death were performed. And among these, none carried more symbolic weight than the offering of the final cup of sherbet in Ottoman culture. Sherbet was a drink of celebration, hospitality, and ceremony. Sweetened with honey or sugar, infused with rosewater, pomegranate, or lemon, it was served at weddings, births, and festivals. But in the harem, sherbet could also mark the end of a life. This was not written in any official code. It was a custom, so old that no one could recall its beginning. Yet everyone knew, if a woman was brought a small cup of sherbet at an unusual hour, carried not by a peer or servant, but by a silent kalfa in plain dress, it was no simple refreshment. The tradition was as much about dignity as it was about death. To die in the harem was, paradoxically, to leave it without scandal. There was no public execution, no clanging of chains or cries in the courtyard. Instead, the condemned was given a final gesture of beauty. A sweet drink served in a porcelain cup, sometimes painted with flowers, plain white. The sherbet was often chilled, beads of condensation forming on its surface, as if to remind the drinker of the fleeting nature of life itself. Some women refused the drink, their lips pressed tight, eyes fixed on the bearer. This was not defiance. Refusal changed nothing, but a small act of control over their final moments. Others accepted it without hesitation, even lifting the cup with steady hands, sipping slowly, as though savoring the last sweetness they would ever taste. There were even those who smiled faintly, as if to say, "If I must go, let me go with grace." It is not known exactly when the sherbet was given relative to the execution. In some cases, it served as a farewell, given hours before the bastangs arrived. In others, it was part of the moment itself, a final drink before the silken cord was drawn tight. Palace chronicles record that the flavor varied. Rose for those who had once held the Sultan's affection, pomegranate for those condemned. In political disputes, lemon for those whose deaths were intended as warnings. Whether this symbolism was universally understood, or merely a later embellishment by chroniclers, remains uncertain. But within the harem, the women spoke of it as fact. One account from the early 18th century tells of a concubine named Ayşe, accused of conspiring with a court official. On the morning of her execution, she was brought a cup of cherry sherbet. She drank it slowly, asked for a second cup, and when told there was none, laughed softly and said, "Then I will take thee." Rest in memory. The bastangs found her seated calmly on her cushions, the empty cup beside her, her hair already loosened, as if she had prepared herself for the journey. The sherbet ritual also held practical benefits for the palace. Sweet drinks could soothe a distressed stomach, calm nerves, or even conceal the taste of sedatives if the execution required absolute compliance. While no surviving records confirm the use of such additives, physicians in the court were well aware of their effects, and the possibility lingers in historical speculation. The cups themselves became strange relics. Some were washed and returned, to use their history unspoken. Others disappeared entirely, perhaps kept by attendants as morbid keepsakes. A few have surfaced in museum collections, delicate porcelain with faint cracks along the rim, their provenance whispered among curators, but rarely printed on placards, not in the minds of the women who lived under the harem's unyielding order. The sherbet cup stood as both a threat and a comfort. To some, it meant the end was near. To others, it meant that even in death, the palace's rituals would grant them a final measure of civility. And so the tradition endured for centuries, its sweetness masking the bitterness beneath. In the vast, gilded machine of the Ottoman court, where loyalty was demanded, and life could be snuffed out without public notice, the last cup of sherbet was the smallest, strangest mercy the harem could offer, a reminder that even the most delicate of gestures, could carry the weight of death. Beyond the latticework windows and guarded doors of the harem, there existed a space known only to a handful of women and the eunuchs who tended it, a small walled garden hidden from the rest of the palace. It was not marked on the official floor plans. The young concubines, newly brought into the harem's world of rules and whispers, often heard of it in fragments. There is a place where the air smells of jasmine, where no man walks, where the nightingales sing as if they are telling secrets. It was called the Forbidden Garden. To the untrained eye, it was simply another courtyard, rectangular, enclosed by high stone walls, over which ivy spilled in thick, twisting ropes. But unlike the grand palace gardens, with their sculpted trees and meticulously raked gravel, this one seemed left to nature's design. Pomegranate trees leaned over the cobbled paths, scattering crimson flowers across the ground. Wild mint grew at the edges, its scent rising with every footstep. At the center stood a small marble fountain, worn smooth by centuries, its basin filled with water, so clear it reflected the moonlight like a silver mirror. Only a few women at a time were ever allowed inside, and never without an escort. Access was a privilege, though no one could say exactly how it was granted. Some claimed it was a reward from the valid sultan for perfect obedience. Others believed it was reserved for those whose beauty had begun to fade, but whose loyalty had never faltered, a consolation before exile to the old palace. Whatever the truth, the garden was a place where the rules of the harem softened, if only slightly. Here, women could remove their heavy veils, loosen their hair, and walk barefoot on the cool stones. They could touch the plants, smell the flowers, even dip their hands into the fountain without fear of reprimand. In a world where every gesture was monitored, these small freedoms felt intoxicating. Yet the garden had its shadows. It was said that long before the present palace was built, this land had belonged to an older residence, one that housed a different dynasty entirely. Some of the older attendants swore the place was haunted, not by vengeful spirits, but by the quiet presence of those who had walked there centuries before. On windless nights, they claimed, the jasmine would tremble as if brushed by unseen hands, and the fountain's water would ripple though no leaf had fallen in. The eunuchs who guarded the entrance treated the place with an unusual respect. They never raised their voices there, never hurried the women along. One senior guard, when asked why, replied simply, "The garden listens." It was an unsettling phrase, and no one pressed him to explain. For some, the Forbidden Garden became a refuge. Women amid harem rivalries would linger there, breathing in the scent of blooming roses, letting the quiet seep into their bones before returning to the constant noise of palace life. Lovers, rare in the harem but not unheard of, used it for stolen moments, a brief meeting of hands or whispered words behind the screen of an orange tree. But the garden could also serve as a stage for power. The valid sultan herself sometimes summoned women there for private conversations. The openness of the space, surrounded by high walls and free from the echoing corridors of the palace, seemed to invite candor, though it also stripped away the protections of anonymity. A woman confronted in the Forbidden Garden had nowhere to hide. One story from the late 16th century tells of a concubine named Lalezar, accused of stealing a piece of jewelry from another favored woman. The valid summoned her to the garden at dusk. Witnesses later said the two walked slowly along the path, their voices too low to hear, until they reached the fountain. There, the valid handed Lalezar a cup of water and spoke a few final words. By morning, Lalezar was gone from the harem. No one knew if she had been exiled, executed, or sent into secret service. The garden kept its silence. In time, the Forbidden Garden took on the qualities of a dream. Women who had been there spoke of it as though it existed in another world, one just out of reach. out of reach. And those who had never set foot inside imagined it endlessly, some picturing it as paradise, others as a place where the air was thick with unspoken danger. Perhaps that was its power, in a palace where every hallway, every chamber, every glance was governed by rules. The garden existed as a space of possibility, a place where the lines between mercy and cruelty, love and betrayal, freedom and captivity blurred until they became indistinguishable. And for those who knew the harem's unyielding truth, that was perhaps the most dangerous thing of all. Deep inside the harem, past the layers of marble halls and winding corridors, there was a small, windowless chamber that most women never saw. Those who did rarely spoke of it afterward, except in the kind of hushed tones reserved for the most dangerous of secrets. The room had no name in the official records, but among the concubines and attendants, it was called the Chamber of Mirrors. It was not large, perhaps the size of a modest bedchamber, but every inch of its walls was covered in polished metal panels, so precisely set that they reflected not only the person standing before them, but also the faintest shift of light from the lamps. By day, the room remained cool and dim, its reflections muted, like water in shadow. By night, under the glow of dozens of oil lamps, it became a place of dazzling disorientation. Every movement multiplied into infinite copies. The origins of the chamber were unclear. Some believed it had been commissioned by an earlier sultan, a man obsessed with beauty and symmetry. Others claimed it had been built by order of a valid sultan who used it to watch the women's reactions during private interrogations. Whatever its original purpose, by the time of Suleiman's reign, the Chamber of Mirrors had taken on a far darker role. It was here that the most delicate accusations were confronted. Theft, betrayal, forbidden love, conspiracy. The mirrors made it impossible to hide. A woman brought into the room would find herself surrounded by her image, her eyes meeting her reflection again and again, as if the chamber itself were stripping away her defenses. Every twitch of her mouth, every blink, every tightening of the hands on her skirts was reflected at her 100-fold. The eunuchs who escorted women to the chamber never spoke. They would lead the accused through the narrow passageways, the sound of footsteps echoing against the stone, until the heavy wooden door swung open to reveal the glimmering walls. Once inside, the door would close, and a valid or another high-ranking woman would begin the questioning. The effect was uncanny. In the stillness of the room, the accused could not look anywhere without seeing herself, sometimes from angles she had never considered. It was said that the mirrors made lies harder to maintain. A woman might begin a falsehood with confidence, only to falter as she saw her face from the corner of her eye, reflected and refracted until it seemed to belong to someone else. One of the most famous incidents in the chamber's history involved a concubine named Farah, accused of passing coded messages to a foreign ambassador. The evidence was circumstantial, but her growing influence in the harem had unsettled those in power. She was brought into the chamber at night, the lamps burning bright. Witnesses said she stood very still, refusing to meet her gaze in the mirrors, answering each question in a steady voice. But as the questioning continued, her composure began to crack, not from the words themselves, but from the way her face seemed to surround her, the same flicker of fear repeating endlessly. By the end, she confessed, though whether the confession was true or a surrender to the room's unrelenting pressure, no one could say. The chamber was not used often. Its power came partly from its rarity. The mere threat of being taken there was enough to unsettle even the most confident courtier. And yet, it was not only a place of intimidation. There were whispers that some women requested to be taken there in moments of personal crisis, to confront themselves, to think, to weigh their choices without the noise of the harem. The mirrors, they said, had a way of showing you not just who you were, but who you might become. Still, for most, The chamber was a place of endings. To leave it was to know that your life in the harem would never be the same, whether that meant exile, punishment, or a sudden rise in favor. The mirrors, after all, did not just reflect. They revealed Dot, and in a world where secrets were currency, and the wrong word could cost you everything. Sometimes the most dangerous thing of all was to be seen too clearly. There was a passage in the harem that few dared to walk. Alone at night, a long, narrow corridor that connected the eastern servants' quarters to the private apartments of the Valid Sultan. It was not grand like the ceremonial halls, nor perfumed like the garden paths. Its walls were plain stone, its floor covered in worn rugs whose patterns had faded with centuries of footsteps. But what made the place infamous was not its appearance. It was its sound. The women of the harem called it the Corridor of Whispers. Even in the stillness of midnight, when the palace seemed to sleep, the corridor carried faint, shifting murmurs, voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They were never loud, never clear enough to distinguish words, but always just enough to unsettle the mind. Some said it was the shape of the passage, a quirk of Ottoman architecture that caused the slightest sound from distant rooms to bend and twist until it floated through the stones like a ghost. Others believed the whispers belonged to the women who had walked the corridor in past centuries and never returned. Their unspoken words caught forever between the walls. The servants, who worked late into the night, swore that if you stood very still in the middle of the passage, the whispers would begin to form patterns. One might hear what sounded like a name, a fragment of a lullaby, or a single urgent plea. No two people have ever heard the same thing. The corridor's location made it more than just a place of eerie reputation. It was the most direct path between the Valid's chambers and the lower servants' wing, and so it became the unofficial artery for palace information. Messages that could not be spoken openly were sometimes passed along it, delivered in hurried footsteps or the quick slip of a folded note into a trusted hand. But such exchanges came at a risk. A corridor had no alcoves to hide in, no convenient shadows. To be seen there with the wrong person could draw suspicion, and suspicion, in the harem, was as dangerous as any weapon. One well-known story told of a concubine named Sapphire, whose beauty had caught the Sultan's attention, but whose alliances lay elsewhere. She was seen one evening walking the corridor of whispers with a senior attendant from the kitchens, a woman known for her loyalty to the Grand Vizier. No one knew what passed between them, but by morning, Sapphire had been moved to a smaller apartment far from the Sultan's wing, and the kitchen attendant had disappeared entirely. The corridor kept its secrets, but the harem did not forget. During the reign of Ahmed I, the whispers took on a more dangerous character. Rumors of plots against the Sultan circulated, and the Valid ordered the eunuchs to watch the passage closely. For several weeks, anyone seen there after dark was detained for questioning, but the whispers did not stop. If anything, they seemed to grow louder, an illusion, perhaps, born of fear, or perhaps something stranger. The eunuchs themselves avoided the passage when they could. One older guard claimed that years before, he had been ordered to escort a newly arrived concubine through the corridor late at night. Halfway along, she froze, her eyes fixed on the wall as though she were listening to something. When he urged her to continue, she whispered, "They're telling me to turn back." The guard laughed it off at the time, but the next day, the girl was gone, sent back to her homeland without explanation. Despite its unnerving atmosphere, the corridor of whispers retained a strange allure. Some women deliberately sought it, convinced that if they listened closely enough, they might hear warnings or advice from those who had gone before. Others used it as a test of courage, walking its length alone at night, returning to boast to their friends that they had heard nothing but the sound of their breathing. But for most, the corridor remained a place of unease, a stretch of stone. That seemed to bend reality just enough to make the air shimmer with possibility. Whether the voices were echoes of the past, tricks of the architecture, or the restless breath of the palace itself, no one could say for certain, and perhaps that uncertainty was the very reason the corridor of whispers endured in palace memory, a reminder that in the harem, not all dangers could be seen, and not all truths could be spoken aloud. Among the many halls of the imperial harem, there was one unlike any other, a passage so filled with fragrance that simply walking through it could make a woman dizzy. It was known formally as the Hall of Aromas, but most of the harem called it the Scented Hall. Though it was not a place for grand gatherings or official ceremonies, its presence was unmistakable. Even from the far end of the harem, the faintest trace of its perfumes seemed to drift toward you like an invisible invitation. The scented hall was long and high-ceilinged, lined with tall wooden cabinets that reached nearly to the beams. These cabinets, carved from dark cedar, were fitted with delicate latticework doors, allowing the air to flow through. Inside, glass jars, ceramic pots, and silk-wrapped bundles were arranged with meticulous care, each containing something rare: spices, oils, herbs, dried petals, saffron from Persia, cloves from Zanzibar, frankincense from Arabia, rose oil from Anatolia, sandalwood from India. Even the floorboards seemed to carry the memory of these scents, as though the wood itself had absorbed them over centuries. God, it was here that the palace perfumers worked, mixing the oils and powders that would scent the sultan's robes, the harem's baths, and the air of the private chambers. Their craft was more than mere luxury. In the Ottoman court, fragrance was both a symbol of refinement and a subtle tool of influence. The right scent could evoke memories, soften tempers, or even inspire affection. For the women of the harem, the scented hall was both a privilege and a danger. Being summoned there meant you were being prepared for something important: a private meeting with the sultan, a festival appearance, or an audience with the valid sultan herself. But it also meant that every detail of your presentation would be judged, not just your beauty or your clothes, but the invisible aura you carried. A fragrance that lingered too long, or one that clashed with the sultan's mood, could undo months of careful positioning. The hall was run by a small, tight-knit group of attendants, all older women who had served in the harem for decades, knew not only the properties of every oil and spice, but also the preferences of each sultan, each consort, even the favored concubines. One might prefer the sharp brightness of lemon oil, another the deep warmth of amber. And there were secret blends, recipes handed down from one perfumer to the next, never written, known only by scent and memory. One such blend, known as Night's Veil, was said to have been created for a concubine who rose from obscurity to become the sultan's chief favorite in less than a year. The perfume was dark and intoxicating, with notes of black rose, myrrh, and a trace of cinnamon. The story went that on the night she first wore it, the sultan refused to see any other woman for weeks. Whether the scent truly held such power, or whether it was the woman herself who inspired his devotion, no one could say. But the scented hall was not only about beauty and seduction. Fragrance in the harem could carry messages too. A handkerchief scented with lavender might mean safety. One with musk might signal danger. Women who could not speak openly learned to communicate with oils and petals, sending coded warnings through gifts that seemed innocent. The perfumers themselves, though outwardly loyal to the valid, sometimes became silent allies in these hidden exchanges. There were darker uses as well. Certain oils, when applied in excess or mixed with the wrong herbs, could cause headaches, nausea, or even fainting. These were never kept in plain sight, but those who knew where to look could find them. More than one rival in the harem found herself mysteriously unwell after receiving a gift of scented powder. One of the most enduring tales of the scented hall concerned a woman named Melike, who was summoned there late one winter's night. No one knew why. She was neither due to meet the Sultan nor involved in any ceremony. She entered the hall and did not emerge until dawn, her expression unreadable. In the weeks that followed, her fortunes rose sharply. She moved to larger chambers, received more jeweled gifts, and began to appear beside the valid Sultan during important events. Some believed she had learned a secret recipe. Others whispered that she had been given something far more potent, a scent that bound the Sultan's thoughts to her alone. The scented hall remained, through all reigns and all shifting alliances, a place of both enchantment and calculation. To walk its length was to be enveloped in the history of the harem itself, each breath a reminder that in this world, even the air you carried could determine your fate. In a place as vast and intricately ordered as the harem, power did not always belong to the most beautiful or even the most intelligent. Sometimes it rested quietly in the hands of those whose duties seemed purely practical. Such was the case with the Keeper of Keys. This was not an official title in the imperial records, yet everyone in the palace knew who held it. She was an older woman, always dressed in plain but immaculate silk robes of deep gray, her hair wrapped tightly beneath a white scarf. She spoke rarely, but when she did, people listened, not because her words were loud, but because they carried the quiet weight of someone who could open or close doors at will. The harem was a maze of chambers, storage rooms, courtyards, and hidden stairways. Not every space was accessible to every woman. Some doors led to private baths reserved for the Sultan's favorites, others to treasure rooms filled with gifts from foreign emissaries. Some apartments had been sealed for decades, their last occupants long gone, but their furnishings left, exactly as they had been. And then there were the dangerous places, narrow staircases that dropped into service tunnels, locked rooms where disciplinary punishments were carried out, small cells for those awaiting transfer or exile. The Keeper of Keys held access to them all. Her keyring was heavy, an ornate loop of brass, worn smooth by decades of handling. It jingled softly when she walked, a sound that many in the harem came to recognize with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The youngest concubines often wondered how she had come to her position. Some whispered that she had once been the Sultan's favorite, others that she had been a trusted servant to a valid Sultan long dead. The truth, like so much in the palace, was uncertain, and she did nothing to confirm or deny the rumors that to be in her favor could be a quiet blessing. A woman who had earned her trust might find herself granted entry to places others could not go. The private library, where rare manuscripts lay hidden. The upper terrace, with its unmatched view of the Bosphorus. Or the secluded orange garden. A place of peace away from the constant surveillance of rivals. But to lose her trust could mean subtle exile within the harem itself. A locked door was more than an inconvenience. It was a signal that one's movement, and thus one's influence, had been curtailed. The Keeper of Keys had a way of appearing exactly where she was least expected. She might turn up outside the baths, just as two women were whispering about a forbidden letter, or in the corridor near the kitchens, as a servant slipped away with food meant for the Sultan. She never accused directly. She only looked long enough for the guilty to feel the weight of her gaze before moving on. Somehow, word would reach the right ears soon after. One of the most remembered stories about her involved a night of sudden panic in the harem. A fire had broken out in a small laundry room, the smoke filling the surrounding corridors. The eunuchs rushed to evacuate the women, but several doors were locked, trapping concubines inside. In the chaos, it was the Keeper of Keys who moved through the smoke, her robes darkened by soot, unlocking each door in turn. By morning, her status was unshakable, and so was the subtle fear she inspired. For if she could save lives with a turn of her hand, she could also withhold that same salvation. She never married, never left the palace. Her quarters were modest, but placed near the center of the harem, allowing her to hear and see much without seeming to intrude. The keys hung beside her bed at night, within reach even as she slept. It was said she had memorized every locks, feel and sound. She could identify one in the dark by touch alone. Over time, her role became more than logistical. She was a silent archivist of palace secrets. Each room she opened and closed held its history. A forgotten scandal, a love. Affair abruptly ended, a meeting that changed the balance of power. She carried these histories the way she carried her keys, quietly, without display, but always ready to use them if needed. For the women of the harem, she was a reminder that beauty faded, alliances shifted, but control over access, the simple right to pass through or be kept out, was a form of power that could last a lifetime. And in a world where so much depended on being in the right place at the right time, no one underestimated the woman who decided which doors would open. Deep in the heart of the harem, beyond the grand marble halls where silk rustled and laughter echoed faintly under domed ceilings, lay a place that seemed to exist outside the rhythms of palace life, the Silent Courtyard. It was not large, and unlike the ornate public gardens that dazzled visiting envoys, it was intentionally simple. A rectangle of pale stone paving framed by slender cypress trees, with a single fountain in the center whose water fell in a steady, quiet trickle. The air there was cooler, as if the space collected the morning shade and held on to it long after the sun had passed overhead. The Silent Courtyard was not open to all. Entry was by invitation only, and even then, not every woman who entered was there for pleasure. It was a place for contemplation, and sometimes for judgment. The valid sultan herself often used it as a meeting ground when she wished to speak with someone privately, away from the curious ears and eyes that filled every other corner of the palace. There were no guards stationed inside its walls, but its very stillness seemed to enforce a kind of invisible discipline. Those who visited described the same unsettling sensation. The moment you stepped inside, all sound from the palace seemed to dissolve. You could see the open archways leading to the corridors beyond, yet the distant clatter of trays, the murmur of voices, the shuffle of servants' feet, all of it faded into a kind of muffled hum. The only sound that remained was the water from the fountain dripping rhythmically into its shallow basin. It was not silence in the literal sense, but a kind of silence that pressed gently against you, making your breath seem louder than it should. Some said the courtyard had been built centuries earlier as a sanctuary for meditation, a gift from one sultan to his most trusted concubine, who was known for her wisdom rather than her beauty. Others believed it had been designed as a place of confrontation, where the absence of noise made even the smallest words fall heavy between two people. Whatever its origin, it was woven into the harem's traditions as a space where truth had a way of revealing itself. The women summoned there often left changed. Sometimes they emerged smiling faintly, as though reassured by whatever had been spoken. Other times, they walked away with eyes fixed to the ground, their faces pale, their movements slow. Rumors spread quickly after such meetings, but no one ever knew exactly what was said within those quiet walls. That secrecy was part of the courtyard's power. There was one occasion, long remembered by the older attendants, when the Sultan himself stepped into the Silent Courtyard with only one other person, a young concubine accused of plotting against one of his favorites. The two sat by the fountain for what seemed like hours, saying nothing at first. Then, in low voices, they spoke briefly, the Sultan leaning forward, the girl looking down at her hands. When they rose, she bowed deeply, kissed the edge of his robe, and was escorted away. By nightfall, her chambers were empty. She was never seen again. The courtyard was not only for confrontation, There were days when the Valid used it as a kind of gentle refuge for those worn thin by the unending tension of palace life. Women who had suffered personal losses, those caught in disputes they could not win, or even those who had simply grown restless. They might find themselves invited to walk slowly along the courtyard's edges, to sit beneath the cypress trees, to watch the water fall into the fountain's basin until their breathing slowed. But its stillness could be dangerous. In the absence of sound, one could hear the faint creak of their thoughts. Doubts and fears had a way of growing louder there, and for some, that was unbearable. A few women even requested never to be brought there again, claiming the silence left them feeling as though the courtyard itself had been listening, storing away their words. The architecture was deceptively simple. No carved inscriptions, no mosaic tiles, no gilded ornament. The walls were smooth, the paving unadorned, the fountain plain. But this lack of decoration seemed deliberate, as if the courtyard was meant to strip away distraction, leaving only the person and the moment. Even the cypress trees, tall and thin, cast narrow shadows that shifted slowly across the stone, marking time in long, silent strokes dotted a palace where almost everything was overheard. The silent courtyard remained a rare exception, a place where words, once spoken, seemed to vanish into the air. But whether that air truly forgot them, or whether the walls remembered more than they revealed, no one could say for certain. Those who knew its quiet best understood that it was not the absence of sound that made the place so powerful. It was the way it made every sound that did exist matter. Among the many chambers hidden within the harem, there was one whose purpose was both practical and almost mythic, a place where the air itself seemed to hold memories. Known simply as the Room of Perfumes, it was located in a discreet wing near the baths, though it had no windows and no obvious connection to the outer world. Its walls were lined with carved wooden cabinets, each with dozens of tiny drawers, their brass handles polished smooth from years of careful use. The moment you entered, the scent would wrap around you, not one fragrance, but a layered tapestry of hundreds, mingling in the warm stillness. The Room of Perfumes was managed by a small circle of attendants, women trained from youth in the art of blending oils, resins, and rare flowers into scents, so refined they could change with the wearer's mood. These attendants were not concubines. They lived in a separate part of the palace and held a status almost outside the harem's hierarchy. They were chemists, herbalists, and artists all at once, and their work was as much about politics as it was about beauty. Perfume in the imperial court was never just a matter of smelling pleasant. Each scent carried meaning, a whisper of status, a subtle declaration of favor, or even a warning. The Sultan's favorites might be given rare oils distilled from ambergris or musk brought overland from the east, their very aroma announcing their importance before they entered a room. A woman seeking to rise in the Sultan's esteem might request a softer blend, one meant to linger in his memory without overpowering him. And there were darker uses too, perfumes mixed with faint narcotics to encourage sleep, or with ingredients that made a rival dizzy or unsteady. The attendants kept detailed records, written in a cipher only they understood, of every blend created and for whom. They knew which concubine favored rose water over jasmine, which preferred the resinous depth of frankincense, and which avoided certain scents entirely because they reminded her of a home she would never see again. In their quiet way, these women held influence over the rhythms of the harem, for a single bottle of oil could shift the mood of an entire evening. One of the most famous creations of the room was known as the Sultan's Hour. It was a subtle blend of sandalwood, myrrh, and a rare white lily that bloomed only for a week each year in the palace gardens. The fragrance was said to grow warmer on the skin over time, so that by the end of an evening, it carried a different note than when it was first applied. This shifting scent was considered dangerously alluring, and it was reserved for only the most intimate encounters. The attendants guarded its recipe with near-religious devotion. But the room of perfumes also had its shadows. There were whispers of bottles sealed away in the highest cabinets, blends too potent, too connected to dangerous memories, to ever be used again. One was said to have been worn by a concubine who charmed the Sultan into changing the line of succession, sparking a chain of political upheavals. Another belonged to a woman whose scent was so intoxicating that foreign envoys spoke of her for years after leaving the empire, until she was found mysteriously dead in her chambers. Whether these stories were true or embellishment hardly mattered. They gave the room an aura of quiet power. Once a year, the Valid Sultan herself visited the room to approve the scents for the coming seasons. She would walk slowly through the narrow space, opening drawers at random, lifting small glass stoppers, and breathing in with eyes closed. The attendants would watch her face for the smallest flicker of reaction, knowing that a single nod could determine the fortunes of a concubine. For the women of the harem, a visit to the room of perfumes was both a privilege and a test. Standing among the shelves, breathing in the layered scents, could stir deep emotions, longing, nostalgia, even grief. Many claimed that certain blends could bring back vivid memories, a childhood summer in the provinces, a lost lover's embrace, a night when the future seemed certain. The attendants said this was no accident. They designed their fragrances to speak directly to the heart dot in a palace where words were often calculated and glances could be dangerous. Scent was a language that could not be easily denied. It lingered in corridors long after the wearer had gone, announcing presence, power, and sometimes warning. And so, the room of perfumes was more than a storehouse. It was a quiet stage where invisible dramas began. Dramas that could play out in whispered conversations, in glances across a banquet hall, or in the way the Sultan's gaze lingered on one woman just a moment too long. There was a long, unlit passage in the inner palace that few dared to walk alone after nightfall. Known among the harem women as the corridor of listening walls, it stretched between the old library and a set of service staircases that descended into the lower kitchens. By day, it seemed harmless enough, a stretch of shadowed stone lined with plain wooden doors, some leading to forgotten storage rooms, others sealed entirely. But at night, it became a place of unease, where every footstep seemed to echo more than it should, and where whispers were said to be carried farther than the speaker intended. The name was not given out of poetry. The walls themselves were part of an ancient design, a network of hollow spaces within the stone that carried sound in unpredictable ways. In the days before the current palace wing had been completed, these spaces were used deliberately by guards and informants. Words spoken at one end of the corridor could be heard clearly in another chamber entirely, sometimes several rooms away. This design, some claimed, had been inspired by older fortresses, where rulers listened to their enemies without ever being seen. In the harem, it served a subtler purpose, keeping the women aware that nothing they said was entirely private. Some concubines avoided the corridor altogether, even if it meant taking the long way to their destination. Others, more daring, used it to send carefully chosen messages. A woman might stand near a certain wall, speaking softly to a trusted attendant, knowing that someone in a nearby chamber would overhear and repeat her words. In a place where influence was as much about suggestion as direct action, the listening, walls became a tool for those clever enough to use them. But the corridor also held a darker reputation. There were stories, always told in hushed tones, of women who spoke too freely there, unaware of how far their voices would travel. One tale told of a concubine who complained bitterly about the Valid Sultan within earshot of the corridor. By morning, she had been moved to a distant wing, stripped of her privileges, and her name never appeared again in court records. Another spoke of a young servant overhearing a plan to smuggle forbidden letters to a foreign envoy. Within days, every person involved had vanished. The physical feel of the place added to its unease. The walls were cool to the touch, even in summer, and the air seemed to carry the faint scent of damp stone. Lanterns were spaced far apart, so shadows pooled thick between them, swallowing the floor in patches of darkness. At times, the faintest draft would slip down the corridor, carrying with it a whisper that might have been words, or might have been nothing more than the wind threading through its hidden channels. Those who spent much time in the harem came to understand that the corridor of listening walls was less a place for walking than for watching. Servants moved along it quickly, their eyes averted. Older concubines would sometimes linger in a doorway, pretending to inspect a robe or range, a tray, while in truth they were listening for what the stone might carry to them. Even the eunuchs, who enforced palace rules with unshakable discipline, treated the space with a quiet respect, as though the walls themselves ranked above them in authority. Architects who studied the corridor centuries later argued that its acoustic properties were likely unintentional, the result of repairs and additions over generations. But those who had lived in the harem knew better. The pattern of doors, the thickness of the stone in some places, and the thinness in others, it all seemed too deliberate to be an accident. And whether by design or coincidence, the effect was the same. The corridor listened. One of the most unsettling aspects was how it blurred the boundary between truth and rumor. A phrase overheard in passing could be repeated half a dozen times before the day was out, each telling adding a layer of certainty or suspicion. In this way, the listening walls were both witness and accomplice, shaping events without ever speaking. For themselves, a woman might find herself suddenly summoned to the valid's private chambers, accused of a remark she barely remembered making, yet unable to prove she had been misunderstood. On rare occasions, the corridor was used as a stage for deliberate deception. A favored concubine might arrange for her rivals to overhear a false confession, knowing they would repeat it to the wrong ears. This was dangerous work, for while the corridor could carry words, it could not protect those who spoke them. More than one woman had learned too late that a lie told in its shadows could turn back upon the teller dot in the still hours before dawn. When the harem lay in the uneasy quiet between night and morning, the corridor seemed to hold its breath. Those few who had reason to pass through it at that hour spoke of hearing faint, fragmented sentences, as though the stone remembered every conversation it had ever carried, and let them slip back into the air when no one was watching. Whether these murmurs were real or born of tired minds, no one could say. But the effect was the same. The corridor left an impression not easily forgotten. For all its dangers, the corridor of listening walls was part of the harem's unspoken education. It taught the women that in this world, words had weight far, beyond their sound, and that sometimes the very walls could be listening. Deep in the northern wing of the harem lay a small, locked chamber that most of the palace inhabitants never saw, yet everyone knew of in whispers. It was not a place for the living so much as a resting place for words, the chamber of unread letters. Tucked away behind a thick cedar door, bound with brass, it held countless scrolls and folded sheets of fine paper, stacked in narrow wooden shelves that rose almost to the ceiling. The air inside smelled faintly of dried rose petals and ink long faded, a scent that clung to anyone who stayed there too long. This was where all letters that never reached their intended recipients ended. Up, some were intercepted by palace officials who deemed them dangerous, messages carrying too much personal longing, too direct an opinion, or simply the wrong name on the seal. Others were written by women who never found the courage to send them, their words sealed in wax, but never entrusted to a messenger. A few came from outside the palace, smuggled past guards and protocol, only to be discovered and confiscated before they could pass into the harem's hands. The chamber had a guardian, a thin, almost invisible eunuch known only as Hafez. No one knew if this was his real name or a title, but he had held the keys for longer than most could remember. His task was not to read the letters, though many suspected he did. It was to preserve them. In his way, he seemed to treat them as living things, dusting the shelves, checking the seals, making sure the paper did not curl with damp. He never explained why the palace kept such a collection, nor why it was hidden rather than destroyed. Perhaps even those in power recognized that these words, unsent, unanswered, carried a kind of quiet power. Some letters were no more than simple notes, a request for more ink, a reminder of a promised visit, a line of poetry written on impulse. Others were heavy with emotion, telling of nights spent in longing, of rivalries that had turned to bitterness, of dreams of a life outside the palace walls. There were declarations of love to the Sultan himself, written in careful calligraphy by women who believed that if he could only read their words, he would summon them instantly. There were farewells written by concubines who knew they would not live to see another season. And there were accusations of betrayal, of theft, of cruelty that might have shattered reputations had they been delivered. No one in the harem was supposed to enter the chamber without permission. Yet stories circulated of women who managed it. One tale told of a young concubine who, desperate to know why her lover's replies had stopped, bribed a guard to distract Hafez. She slipped inside and found not only his letters to her, unopened and unmarked, but also ones he had written to others before she ever knew him. In those pages, she discovered truths that unraveled her image of him entirely. She left the chamber with no letters in hand, but her expression was changed forever. There were also stories of women who left letters of their own in the chamber, trusting that it was safer for their thoughts to remain unread than to risk the consequences of delivery. In this way, the room became a kind of confessional, where secrets could be spoken in ink without the danger of a human audience. The knowledge that those words would remain forever sealed gave a strange comfort to some, and an unbearable frustration to others. Once a year, near the quiet turn of winter, the valid sultan was said to visit the chamber alone. She would take no attendance and give no orders for the day. She would unlock the door herself, disappear inside for hours, and emerge without a single sheet of paper in her hands. No one knew if she read the letters or merely stood among them, listening to the silence they carried. But after each visit, changes would ripple quietly through the harem. A woman moved to better quarters, a small stipend granted to a servant. A rivalry suddenly resolved without explanation. Some claimed the chamber of unread letters had its kind of magic. Words trapped inside paper, never spoken aloud, were said to hum faintly in the air, weaving invisible threads between those who had written them and those who might have received them. Over time, the room gathered a weight of unspoken longing, regret, and hope that could be felt like a hand on the shoulder. Those who had stood there described it as both comforting and suffocating, a place where every whisper of ink seemed to wait for a reader who would never come. In the last years of the harem's prominence, when the empire itself was beginning to shift and the palace was no longer the unshakable center it had once been, the chamber took on a new significance. More letters arrived than ever before, as people sensed the fragility of their positions. They wrote in hurried hands, trying to secure alliances, confess feelings, or plead for mercy before it was too late. Yet still, many of these were intercepted, added to the shelves without ever reaching their intended eyes. When the harem was finally dissolved, much of its physical beauty was dismantled or repurposed, its gardens opened to the public, its silks sold, its rooms emptied. But the chamber of unread letters remained locked. Even when officials cataloged the palace archives, they left that door unopened. Perhaps they feared what would be found inside, or perhaps they understood that the room's true value lay not in the words themselves, but in the fact that they had never been read. And so, behind the cedar door, the shelves still stand, holding centuries of sealed paper, each sheet a fragment of a life lived within the palace walls. The ink may have faded, the seals may have cracked, but the emotions pressed into those pages remain as strong as the day they were written. They were written. They are the harem's final secret, waiting in silence, untouched, unseen. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that never reach their ending.